Testament prophecy, he draws attention to the exciting questioning that it generated. Matthew 21:10-11, we read, when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, who is this? The crowds answered, this is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. That's what Matthew was trying to communicate. Luke, on the other hand, highlights the obviousness of what is happening. His readers go away knowing that if the crowds hadn't cried out then the rocks would have done so. And John focuses on the sort of later understanding that the disciples had as they reflected on the events. But Mark, in a way in which we probably have become used to over the past few weeks, tells the story without comment. I mean, certainly not for the first time. I mean, after all, Luke tells us that Jesus and his parents travelled up to Jerusalem for the Passover every year. Jesus is approaching Jerusalem for Passover. He might have grown up and then lived in Galilee, but he was no stranger to Jerusalem or to its surrounding towns and villages. Neither, I think, it's safe to assume that this was the first time that he'd approached with his disciples. They'd been following him for around 3 years, hadn't they? And celebrating Passover in Jerusalem would have been the norm. But today is different. I don't know where you grew up. I grew up here. Oh, there we go. I should have put that up. I'll get this right one day. This is where I grew up. This is where I spent most of my life. Other than the first 3 years of my sort of childhood, I lived in fact, the house that's got the spot on it. We had an attached garage actually when I lived in that house. That road is a trunk road, or at least those of us of a certain generation would know it as a trunk road. They don't tend to think about trunk roads these days, do they? It's now known as the A1156. Then it was the A45, which itself was renumbered a few years ago to the A14. This was the only route from London and the Midlands to Felixstowe Docks. Hence, it was named Felixstowe Road. And Felixstowe Docks was already, at that stage, 50 odd years ago, I suppose 55 years ago, the largest of the three haven ports. It's now humongous. Felixstowe Dock will take, I think, the biggest of the container ships that circumnavigate the world. And even then it was huge. Every Volvo car that was imported into the UK during the 1970s and 80s was driven on a transporter along that piece of tarmac. In the days before social media, every new model was spotted and discussed as it drove past my house. And if you can't really see it, it is there just about. You can just about make out church tower with a huge cross that was at the bottom of the hill, and at night that cross was visible across the town and further. And the more I see that view, the more I realise actually what Mum and Dad sacrificed due to Susie's ill health. They moved to a detached house because she used to keep the neighbours awake on the estate where we were born, and they knew that Susie kept them awake because the neighbour used to come in the mornings and tell Mum to go to bed, and that she would take care of Susie and I while Mum got some sleep. I didn't appreciate where I lived. It looks an incredible sort of house, doesn't it, really? I didn't appreciate it as a child, but I knew everything that was happening in Felixstowe. You literally couldn't get to Felixstowe without going past our house. Not quite true, but because there was a route through a tiny village called Bucklesham, which was home to you might remember this guy, Mick Mills, who was captain of Ipswich and England in his time. He lived there. But anything worth happened past our house. And I well remember helping Dad drape a Union flag from the front bedroom windows the day the Queen drove to Felixstowe to join the Royal Yacht Britannia. Sat on the wall, we waved our flags and clapped and cheered. We weren't nosy, we were just interested. And interested meant we found out stuff. We knew which lorries were new, we knew which ones came every day, and which ones the drivers had fallen asleep in as they ended up in our front garden. Now, Mary's dad didn't grow up on a trunk road, but alongside the Manchester Ship Canal during World War II. It was a similar experience that Stanley had, as the GIs were transported down the canal and into Manchester. Sweets, nylons, and I'm sure other stuff unavailable in the UK were thrown to the locals on the canal side. Again, he and his siblings knew what was happening. In both these cases, being on a major transport route shows that it's not just vehicles that are being moved, it's people and news and gossip. And on this first century trunk road that Jesus and his disciples are approaching Jerusalem on for Passover, they come to the towns of Bethany and Bethphage. They've travelled through the wilderness, coming up towards the summit of the Mount of Olives. And we can see on this map, Bethany is reached just over there on the right first before you get to Bethphage. Bethphage is at the top of the Mount of Olives. And the residents of these towns would have been very aware of the travellers. Perhaps the stories of Jesus and the teaching and miracles that he'd done recently would have been known as the travellers made their way up to the city. The people would have met those who knew him, those who claimed to know him, and those who had just heard about him. And of course, they would have met the disciples and Jesus himself over the years. Bethany, of course, was the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, people who had become friends and followers of Jesus. So perhaps the news had started to buzz among the travellers, some moving quicker than others, maybe some running on ahead. The teacher's coming. Jesus is on his way. What's going to happen? Is he going to say more and more? He's been saying more and more strange stuff. He's coming. And Jesus speaks to his disciples and gives them instructions. And so we come to the first of my 3 points this morning. And that's that the disciples are being obedient. And I wonder if this isn't Mark's chief point in this account of the first Palm Sunday. After all, we've read 11 verses that sum up that day, in Mark's opinion, and this single point covers 7 of those verses. Well over half of it, Mark concentrates on the disciples being obedient. He spends far more time here than in the rest of the day's events. And in summary, he says, go to the village ahead, follow these instructions, and bring the donkey back here. Jesus is very specific. Go to the village ahead. Not just any village, but that village. Go, do it, don't leave it. As you enter, you won't need to search, just keep your eyes open. There's an unridden colt, be tied up. How would they know it had not been ridden? I don't know. Who's left it tied up? Questions in their heads. They're to untie it and bring it to Jesus, but it belongs to someone else. It will be dangerous as, the New Testament translators are fairly nice here, aren't they? It's unridden. I think we would say it's not broken. You have to break a horse before you can ride it, or a donkey. This is a wild, really quite a wild animal still. What if it doesn't want to go with them? Donkeys can be stubborn. If anybody asks, Jesus is foreseeing that there might be some obstructions. Disciples might have to deal with difficult situation. They're to say the Lord needs it. Much, I think, if you read around this, has been written about who the donkey belonged to, how they got away with this. Personally, I think it's clear that Jesus was well known in this area. This isn't the first time that he's been there. This is a busy route up to Jerusalem. Jesus has travelled it before, and there are people here who are his friends. It doesn't mean that it belongs to one of his friends, but it certainly means that he was known. You know, 40 years after I lived on Felixstowe Road, I can still remember Mick Mills's Renault Fuego and the sight of his 2 old English sheepdogs stuffed in the back of it as he headed home from the roundabout at the bottom of the hill where the church stands. You know, I think Jesus would have been remembered. Somehow, it doesn't matter to me how Jesus knew the donkey was there. This doesn't figure in my thinking. Jesus knew that there was an unridden donkey tied up in the village. He knew that the owner would let him borrow it. Divine intervention or human relationships. The important thing was that the disciples did as they were instructed. Here is the Son of God, about to ride into Jerusalem as the Messiah. And it hangs on the obedience of 2 of his disciples. Just think about that again. Jesus is just about to fulfill Old Testament prophecy. Zechariah 9:9 says this: "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And it relies on 2 disciples fetching a donkey that is tied up outside a house on a village street. What if they'd said no? I mean, downright defiance. They could have done, couldn't they? You can blame them, really. Why us 2? Why not them? What if there's no donkey? What if we look really stupid? What if the owner beats us up? You can list the excuses for A, not going at all, B, not finding the donkey, C, disappearing entirely. But here is the Son of God entrusting this task to the likes of you and me. And then, having gone, probably their biggest nightmare occurred, didn't it? They were challenged when they went to untie the donkey. "What are you doing?" And the disciples remembered what Jesus had said to say, "The Lord needs it, and we'll send it back here shortly." And the people accepted it, and so they brought the donkey back, threw their cloaks on its back, and prepared it ready for Jesus to ride. You know, I think they probably had forgotten that it was that bit about it not having been ridden before. Because I don't know about you, but throwing cloaks on the back of an unridden donkey, I'd be pretty scared that I might be getting a kick coming my way, rather than just sort of like a nice little nod from a donkey. These 2 unnamed disciples, on whom the fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy was dependent, were obedient. People like us, people who had to choose to do what Jesus asked them to do. It's nothing major, really. It's just getting a donkey. But it's huge. And they could have said no and walked away. But they didn't. They chose to obey. I wonder, what is it that Jesus is asking you to do? It's probably not major. It'll be something you can choose to say no to and walk away from quite easily. But it's quite possibly of huge significance in the kingdom. Will you walk away, or will you obey? Well, if that's not a follower, but looking on. And let's just think for a moment about the crowd and getting involved. They're at the top of the Mount of Olives. There you go. That's, I've written here, this is the view today. No, it's not. This is the view about 11 and a half months ago. Looking across the Kidron Valley to the Temple Mount. And the Jewish temple would have been on the flat space to the left. You can just about make out the gold dome, and the temple at Jesus' time would have been to the left of that, the area to the left of the temple. But the valley is steep. This is looking the other way, looking back up to the top of the Mount of Olives. Where there are now tombs, there would have been olive groves, and the road would have wound its way through the olives to the bottom of the valley along the river and then up to the Golden. Not these days carry a man straight down that road because it is just so steep. But Jesus rode this unridden donkey along the windy road down through the olives. And as he did so, Mark tells us, many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." Away and providing a rear guard, close by or at a distance, the crowd shouted, "Hosanna! Save us! Help us! Hosanna!" Not perhaps praise, but a cry for God's help. And then words that recognise Jesus as coming in God's name, recognising the message of the gospel that the kingdom of God is at hand. Hosanna! Save us in the highest heaven. And you know, a crowd draws a crowd, doesn't it? But this crowd set out preparing the way, alerting folk to the fact first Palm Sunday, as they were the ones crying out to God to act, crying out to God for something to happen. Did they get the significance of the gate to which he rode? You see, the Golden Gate was one that would feature significantly later in the week. This is the gate where the sacrificial lamb is chosen for the Passover celebration. This is the route into the city and then onto the temple that the lamb would take. It is the entry point of our sacrificial lamb, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Watching on. Will you join the crowd? Will you call out to God for salvation? Will you proclaim the coming King? Or will you just continue to watch safely at a distance, thinking it doesn't matter for now? But you know, it does matter. At the age of 23, 6 years after leaving home and effectively making herself homeless, my sister Susie passed away in her sleep. All the 2020 hindsight in the world couldn't change that. And you know, we have a massive advantage over those in this crowd we're thinking about who chose not to join in, or who chose to scream "Crucify" a few days later. We have not 2020 hindsight. We have, if it were possible, 100 hindsight. We know what happens, and we have the opportunity to join in today. Right now or after the service, Paul challenged us in communion, didn't he? Don't let today go without responding. Jesus said that we should not worry about tomorrow because today has enough cares of its own. You know, he's right. Don't put this off until tomorrow. Today is the day to respond. But what of Jesus on that first Palm Sunday? We've thought about the disciples, we've thought about the crowd. His day continued as it would for the Passover lamb. Sorry, there we go, we've had that. Jesus made his way to the temple where we find him checking it out. Jesus goes to the temple courts The pace of Mark's gospel is maintained. There's no hanging around, no diversion to a friend's house, no seeking out a meal. Jesus goes straight to the temple. Having entered through the golden gate, the place at which the sacrificial lamb was chosen, he walks the road that the sacrificial lamb would have walked. In chapter 2 of Luke's Gospel, we read of the time when 21 years before the account we are considering this morning, as a pre-teen, Jesus and his family were attending Passover in Jerusalem. And Jesus was left behind as they made their way home. Jesus' response on being found was, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" Perhaps that compulsion, that having to be in his Father's house, was just as great on this occasion. Knowing as he did what the future held, was he driven to come into the physical home of God in that community? Was there a particular closeness that he would have had to his Father in that place? You know, as you walk through the tunnels today that take you at first century level around the walls of Jerusalem, you reach a point where you're at the very back of the temple wall. At the point, knowing as we do sort of construction and layout of the temple, where this is simply the wall between you and the Holy of Holies, the place where the priests only entered by a special ceremonial process once a year. And then they do it with a rope around their ankles so they can be pulled out if for some reason they don't make it out of their own accord. The Holy of Holies, the place where the presence of God resided amongst his people. And this, despite it being chilly and many metres underground along a narrow tunnel, was one of the thin places, one of the places where you sensed that the separation between the physical world and heaven was wafer thin. So Jesus, the Son of God, the one who had left heaven and come to earth with the express intent of dying, that the price of our sin may be paid in full, and then that we might have free access to his Father's presence for eternity. Jesus, the one who knew that total separation from his Father, not just leaving heaven to be incarnate on earth, but separation at the spiritual level, was going to be the outcome of the next few days, came to the temple, came to his Father's house, came to where the presence of the Father was wafer thin away, came, and to quote verse 11 of our reading this morning, looked around at everything. And here are perhaps supposed 100 hindsight kicks in again. In our minds we see the dove dealers, the pigeon people, the money makers, the wicked, the faithful, those being taken advantage of, those lining their pockets, the priests, the teachers, the disciples, the lonely, the families, the crowds, those pushing, the noise, the quiet corners, the Jewish born, the converts, the masters, the servants, the men, the women, children, travellers, the locals, those with no bed for the night. And we don't really have 100 hindsight, do we? Whatever you imagine, there will have been more. Peter's recollection that Mark records here is that it was late. Mark writes, but since it was already late, he's hinting that this was not it, that the visit to the temple was incomplete, it was unsatisfactory. But now was not the time. Now was the time to return to Bethany, to the hospitality that awaited there. We can imagine, can't we, in our mind's eye? Mary and Martha would probably be hosting the party when they got back. I can't imagine that they weren't there on the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So do they hurry back with some others to get everything ready now, preparing the evening meal, excitedly recalling the road covered still with branches as their beloved Jesus had ridden down the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem. Now they head back up that way. Crowds gathering, crying out for God's salvation. Now were they ready to sit at his feet as he ate and drank and taught that night. You know, Jesus saw the state of the temple. He saw what men had made it. And totally contrary to what we expect from Mark's action-packed ethos gospel, the gospel of the immediate, the gospel with no time to take a breath, Jesus took it all in and returned to Bethany. Perhaps for most human of reasons, because it was late. They were probably tired. They were undeniably hungry. There is no ethos. There is a pause. Jesus waited. He took time. He paused. Here is the climax of his ministry. He made sure the time was right, that the actions to come were right, that he was in step with his Father. You know, today is Palm Sunday. There's a real danger that we run headlong into Holy Week, determined to take advantage of Easter, be that the release from our Lenten disciplines or just allowing ourselves to gorge on Easter eggs, promising we'll invite all our neighbours and friends to the Easter trail and our all-age celebration on Easter Day. We remember to read all the Holy Week Bible stories in all the Gospels. But this morning, let's just pause, as Jesus did. Let's look around. Let's think about this world in which we live, a world in which a young woman's health becomes gossip on social media, where people go into a crowded concert and murder hundreds. Let's consider those who are suffering and in need. Who is it who's on the edge of the crowd you could encourage to pick up the cry to God for salvation? Not the whole street. Just the ones who are looking on, inquisitive, asking questions. Or maybe that's you today. Are you looking on? Did you watch as we took bread and juice and had to get some more made up because we didn't have enough faith before the service for how many people were going to be here? Or have you taken it because, well, everyone does, and you don't want to stand out as different? Go on, do what those who joined that crowd did. Pick up the cry for yourself. Hosanna, God save me. What is Jesus asking of you if you're one of his disciples? Could be something so very simple. Go and get a donkey. But you still need to be obedient today and to do it. So let's pause. It's late. Perhaps we're tired. Perhaps we're hungry. This is not an ethos moment. This is a moment just to listen. So let's perhaps just close our eyes. We're going to listen to a song. The words will be on the screen. It's not a song that we know. It's just the words. They'll colour change, but nothing very much on the screen. So you can just listen or you can watch the screen. But let's just pause at the beginning of this Holy